grieve, we normally think of it, as I mentioned before, as a human activity, but there's actually some observation that other animals feel that too. And they even feel it when another animal dies or is taken away, and they often will go into a kind of a panic if they don't understand whatever happened to that other animal. But there, you can see that they exhibit some of the same behaviors as people. So when you when we when I observe that other animals react in some similar way to humans to a certain stimuli, then I start to question whether or not it's something that's deeply embedded into our physical being, our brains, and the way we process emotions and other kinds of information. So, uh, observing that, I come to feel like it's such a deep part of who we are that it's worthwhile paying attention to how to cope with it because it can incapacitate us. While grieving is something that is uh, normal and human, um, if we let it get out of our control, it can spiral us into places where we don't want to be. So it's useful to be able to have an appropriate response to grief. And that's kind of the purpose of introducing this conversation, is to help us to kind of crowdsource ways that we might address our grief. Because often people say, oh, cheer up, but it ain't time yet. We're not ready to cheer up, and we have to go through a certain cycle and we have to let it work out. Sometimes we won't face the grief. We bury it because we don't want to show it. And so we not only not show it to others, we try to deny it in ourselves. And that could kind of cause us to have some, maybe that feeling comes out in something else. It comes out in fits of anger. It may come out in being short with other people and being less connected to other people, simply because we have not dealt with something that has caused us some grief. So, with that in mind, I would like to uh, start a conversation and start an effort here to crowdsource how we feel about grief and also how we cope with grief. So I think the first question is, um, what kinds of things have caused you grief? Okay. And by the way, I put the questions in the chat box, and along with that, I have some references for you, and you just take the references and just sort of copy them someplace, and then you can go back and read them, because if you try to massage all of that, you'll miss half of the conversation. But if you hear the conversation and are involved in the conversation, when you read those, they will it will be helpful that you have already had a conversation and kind of get the 50,000-foot view about grief. And you have also worked on formulating what you feel about grief and how you either have coped, are coping now, or will cope in the future with grief. And it puts it in context for you. So I would suggest that you leave trying to read all of that other data, because it can be quite dense, uh, for later. But for now, if you could, you know, share with us some of your ideas, I think it would help to provide a useful discussion. So with that, what kinds of things have you grieved?
I'll say what I've grieved over. I've had quite a bit of experience in my life with grief. When I hear the word, I immediately think of death. That's one commonality I think we definitely all have. I was first introduced to some thinking about it way back when I was in the midst of a unit of social workers, and we were talking about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. It's been helpful. The things I read there and talked about at that time and have experienced, I always draw from, even if subconsciously, when I realize that I'm in a situation where grief is with me. I think it really does help to have some knowledge of what to expect, what are the usual, and not necessarily that you will feel all of them, but some of the usual ways that grief affects us individually. And that's a good place to start, because then when you experience these things, such as a return of the depth and the sadness of grief unexpectedly, you will know that that's a normal, it's like waves of the sea washing in on you. And so that's a starting place for me as far as knowing grief and what to expect from it.
Mhm. Thank you, Betty. Thank you very much. Are there other things that people have grieved? Death is probably the thing that really comes up most often when we think of grief. That's when we see it most. But I think we grieve other things too. What other things you think of?
Well, I mean, I know you've heard me talk about this probably ad nauseum in some ways, but separation, our isolation from people, loved ones, family,
Mm.
you know, I think when you get down to it, the common thread with what you expect largely from grief, in that case, it's just isolation. You really do feel like you've been removed from people.
Mm.
So it's a similar thing, maybe not, I mean, the permanence isn't probably at all like you look at in death, but there's a similarity in that, in a situation like it's been over the past couple of years, is not knowing what it will end up being. If you don't see, your own child who's like 15, 16 years old for 2 years,
Mm.
when I mean, in person,
Mm.
when you see, you don't know who they'll be necessarily when you see them again, because kids change so rapidly anyway.
Yes.
Hey, can you hear me, Lawrence?
Yes.
I grieve the suffering of others,
Mm.
both present and past.
Mm.
In some ways, especially past.
Mm.
I think there's an understandable collective grief among some peoples. I'm thinking first and foremost of African Americans and American Indians. I grieve their past in certain ways. I can't fully realize them, of course, but it's hurtful to think about them, as it is hurtful to think about continuing discriminations and inequities.
Mm.
These things burden me.
Mm. So a kind of vicarious grief, empathetic grief. Uh,
Yeah, I
Mm.
suppose it feels a little closer than that, but I suppose those are words for it.
Mhm. Interesting. Interesting.
This
Other,
is this is Jace
uh-huh.
Lawrence.
Yes.
Um, when when uh, when Charles was talking about, American Indians and Black Americans, African Americans, certainly we share, as tribal people, we share similarities in terms of grieving. And what has really sustained me throughout the years is actually our culture and our way of life, and how we look at death and how we look at separation and isolation. And if we can cling to those and look back to how our ancestors survived in the past and how they dealt with uh, the loss and death, that seems to be something that comforts me and also comforts many of our people. And prayer is a big part of that. And and understanding that not only as humans we grieve, but other animals grieve as well, and other life forms. Even plants grieve the loss of their plant members. You automatically think of whales and dolphins and elephants because they grieve as well. There are examples of that in the wild. And also the buffalo, who we looked at as part of our um, how we came to be. We are closely allied with the buffalo in our survival. And so the buffalo also, um, they grieve for one another, and you can see it. You can see the tears in the eyes of buffalo when when they when they've lost, especially a mother has lost one of her children. So, I think of a whole range of things, but coping mechanisms is something that I think of, and we have to deal with it somehow. And I think our culture is what has sustained us in that grieving process.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Jace, can you talk to us a little bit about how that happens? Can you pinpoint or underline some things, practices, etc., that you connect to the culture helping you to deal with grief?
Well, first of all, it's the philosophical belief. It's how we look at death. And
Mm.
we don't exclude our children from that because death is a part of life. And so we don't, they're included in the ceremonial aspects of it and the process in terms of burials but of course we talk to them. We just don't let them come and observe. We have them experience it, but we also explain things and show them the importance of life. And many of our ceremonies talk about the importance of life, even our loss of a loved one. They call it the keeping of the soul. When we keep that person's soul for a year, we are acknowledging that that person will never be forgotten. And we honor that person throughout the whole year. And then we have a releasing of the soul ceremony after a year. And so that, but what it really does, it reminds us of the importance of life and how to take care of one another. Because during that year, people bring food and things that family might need. We can't forget about them because they are oftentimes, in the past especially, were in isolation. They would be in their teepee, and the people would leave things in front of their teepee that might help them material wise, but emotionally, all the rest of the camp, the people were praying for them and hoping that they would make it through this process, because that some people grieve so hard that they want to be with their loved one. And so we have songs and one of our Sundance songs talks about how the the uh, the the loved one left her, or she left him, and so he has a song about how much he misses her and loves her, and and so their physical body is gone is another philosophical belief, but their soul is always there someplace. up in the spirit world or else around us and comes back to visit us. Even in death, our loved ones continue to love us from wherever they are.
Mm. Thank you very much. Thank you
I
very much.
might add, Lawrence, I might add something to what Jace just said. Had the experience of war, and then the experience of spending a lot of time with tribal people in various circumstances. And as a veteran, I found the tribal way of collective grieving or community comforting very heartening. Tribal people in various circumstances were more comforting to me than my own community, who I also dearly loved. But I think the majority of society approach to loss is to create some distance. And in contrast to that, tribal people from the heart empathize with that, I think. And they demonstrate that in various ways. And I'm appreciative, you know, whenever I go to a powwow, it still makes me feel good to go to a powwow and see the grand entry and see those vets in the uniforms of various wars, you know, being marching in with the flags and being honored and in some ways, I think, comforted by that community of feeling which tribal people know so well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else have a comment about what kinds of things that you grieve? Because so far we've been seemed anyway to have been talking about death, and also Todd brought in separation, grieving separation. Are there other things that you find that yourself or other that you or someone you know have grieved? Well, while you're thinking about it, and please do keep thinking about it, because the more things we can include in this conversation, I think the more beneficial it will be to everyone. Sometimes we grieve loss of things like a job, you know. We grieve not just the work and the paycheck, but we grieve the loss of the community that's in that job. You know, that the loss of a job, especially one that you have invested some amount of emotion with the people there, that can feel like a kind of ostracization, uh, because when we work long hours, the people who we spend the most time with becomes a kind of de facto family. And there are many people who spend more time with their coworkers than they do with their families, especially if you subtract the amount of time they're asleep and therefore not really connected with them. They might spend 2 hours or less with their family, and they spend 10 hours, 8, 10, 12, and more hours with those people. So those people, you know, whether they love them or hate them, they become family. You're with them all the time. You know, you're breathing in more of their breath than you breathe in the breath of your family, you know. So, and you probably know more about them than you do your family, and so often your own kids, you know. I remember this one case that, you know, we're talking about a similar thing in Japan once, and this one father talked about how he worked so much that one day something happened and he was off on a Saturday, and his kid got up from, he was at the breakfast table. The father was at the breakfast table, and the kid got up and he was sort of came in and was kind of wiping the sleep from his eyes, and he looked at his mom and said, "Mom, who's that man?" Because when he went to sleep, when he went to work, the kid was in bed sleeping, and when he came back home, the kid was asleep. And he saw the kid, but the kid never saw him. So, maybe that's an extreme kind of case, but given the amount of working hours that many people spend on their job, it's hard to see how they would have the hours that would be, that would equal the kind of hours they have with their coworkers. So when you lose that job, that could be just like you got tossed out by your family. It could feel like a divorce, in a way. And that's a thing that people grieve, when they have, some kind of divorce or something like that. People grieve losing a home, because maybe that home there were so many memories in that house. There are so many things that made them, it became a part of them. So that when they're not in that house, let's say they have to go to a nursing home or something like that, part of that separation process is a certain kind of grieving, because the things you're familiar with are no longer there. So those are a few things. I'm just, looking for any other kinds of things that you have grieved.
I think one thing that I've thought about a bit that everybody has some experience with is actually it sounds funny at first, but when you think about it, the grief of kind of loss of your own, sometimes like, people call it like, the loss of their youth, but really it's more like loss of certain capabilities, either physical or even mental, and sometimes even emotional.
Mm.
As you grow older, and we wrap it in something a little usually shinier, like nostalgia. But nostalgia is really kind of a form of grief sometimes, particularly when you think back on yourself and, the things and the people you're with and who you were in that time. Sometimes it feels like you can't get back to that.
Mm.
And there's a form of grief there. And it may not be necessarily as sharp as kind of like the immediate physical loss of someone, but part of you or the person that you thought of yourself. So it's kind of an identity thing when you lose a piece of your identity because for me, I remember when I couldn't play competitive basketball anymore, my Achilles were just shot, and it was hard because a lot of my identity, like you said, if you spend a lot of time at something and you have an identity wrapped up in that, the loss of that is a form of grief. You feel like you can't take part in that community anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least not the way you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of a line from a poem when Todd mentions loss of physical self, and certainly that's a very real thing. I can tell you, getting to the point where you can't do what you used to be able to do. In some ways, maybe that's more acute if you've been pretty athletic than it might otherwise be. I wish I could think of the name of the poem, but it's about a guy who's trying to still play basketball, pick up basketball with younger guys.
Mm.
And he can't keep up, and he's trying to come to terms with that. But the line that amuses me is, "Body, come back, all is forgiven."
Yes.
Well, of course, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Get used to it.
Yeah.
You can't make that move anymore. Or you can't make it when you used to make it. When you do make it, it's too late. So there's that. Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah, all these things always go back to loss, I mean, uh, one of the very interesting forms of grief is the loss of a limb, you know, to the point that some people will, let's say, lose an arm, but then they still feel an itching on their hand, which of course we don't see any physical way how that could happen. But sometimes, you know, there is a deep sense of loss when you have an amputation, you know, that that can feel, like your whole life gets rearranged. But and so that's a thing, but also the depth of not just the physical pain, but the emotional pain of feeling like you're less than. I know I've talked to women friends of mine who have had, let's say, whether they're breast removals or hysterectomies and things like that, and the deep sense of loss that they have, and that we've had conversations about, and I feel privileged to be able to have shared that. And but that's a certain insight that I think that's important for more men to share. And of course men have things that they lose too, and it's vice versa. But I think that understanding and feeling, and understanding that grief can come in all these kinds of form, not just when we lose someone to death, I think can help us cope with the death, because it can help us to look at it in different ways that we experience it, and when we can put a word on something, it often helps us to cope with that. So with that, I'd like to move uh, to talking about grief experiences. What kind of things and emotions or incidents that happens when you're feeling grief? What kind of things did you experience? What were you feeling when you felt grief?
Harkening back to Elizabeth, excuse me, someone else speaking.
Go ahead, Betty.
Uh, Elizabeth Keebler-Ross listed the 10 stages, which I can't rattle off, thank goodness. But one of the first ones is denial. And I guess my first most shocking grief experience is when my younger brother was suddenly killed. And I'd be walking around the city where I lived, and he lived nearby at that time too. And I'd suddenly see someone up ahead of me, and I was sure it was him. From the back, it looked just like him. And then I'd have to again experience the fact that he was dead. I don't think that's unusual, because it's so much in the front of who you are. You're going to have those kind of expectations going forward. And another companion emotion of grief is the anger, which Lawrence mentioned in his introduction. And that's normal, but if people don't understand and expect that, either in themselves or someone whom they know who's experiencing it, that can add to the discomfort of getting through it quite a lot.
Mhm. Mhm. Jace, you were going to say something?
Okay, thanks, Betty. I was, that like probably all of us have had some sort of experience that has really sort of incapacitated us for a while, and had to cope with and had to deal with a loss or a death. And my husband and I had to deal with the loss of our firstborn son. And so, and it was around Christmas time. And so every December 14th, so every time that part of the year comes around, I'm certainly happy for my two sons that are living that I had afterwards. But the first son, we have to mourn his loss. Well, we do mourn his loss by praying and going and praying for him and his soul. But my husband and I dealt with that together because of the loss of our mutual son. And so he's buried with my husband, who passed away on May 24th. And so I'm going to be experiencing again an anniversary of his loss. And that's what he taught me about. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he was also the end of Korea, but he was a Vietnam veteran and a Green Beret and highly decorated. And he's buried in National Cemetery at Sturgis. And my husband used to talk about anniversaries in which he had lost buddies in the war, and because he had gotten very close to his different platoons and different groups of in firefights and whatnot, and so he would even remember the anniversaries of different individuals, consciously and subconsciously, that who passed away in Vietnam, and he would think of them, and that we always knew around Thanksgiving that he lost some. He was in a really big firefight then, and so he lost loved ones there, his buddies, and so we have to really work with him and love him more during those times, because he really suffered during that, on those anniversaries of death. And so that's one thing that he taught me, to honor and recognize those feelings during that time, and acknowledge it, but also pray for the soul of those that were lost. So, people say that, you can empathize with folks who are parents who have lost a loved one, a child, but it truly affects you for the rest of your life. And so you try to deal with that in the best way that you can. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Your body remembers even when you think you might forget. It took me years to realize that I was not just suffering from the onset of fall, but it was approaching the date of my brother's death. And once I recognized that and started anticipating it, I didn't suffer so much from it. I think Jace is saying things that are right along that way. You will grieve whether you know it or not, and it's really helpful. And also to have your other people around you who understand and help you during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could there be long-term consequences of grief? And if so, would anybody be interested in sharing that with us?
Well, of course, grief is debilitating if you don't find comfort, if you can't find a way to process it. And so I think the longer it goes, not being processed, the more threatening it is. So one of my daughter told me the other day that one of her high school friends' father is a Vietnam veteran who is just now suffering from PTSD. I suppose because he stuffed all that for so long.
Because he
what? I suppose because he stuffed all that for so long, avoided it. I don't know him, but now he's having significant. Man, I assume is probably in the 70s, having significant PTSD problems from losses he experienced, 50 years ago. So I do think that grief accumulates over time, it worsens if you don't find a way to live better with it. You don't outlive it, of course, but you find a way to move forward with it in positive ways. I've said this before in our other conversations, that I think life is so much about trying to find a way to turn negative experience into positive energy.
Yes.
I was asked by a television interviewer one time, a long time ago, what for you was the worst thing about the war? And I said, without even thinking, it was just the tip of my tongue, the death of friends. And yes, I remember those deaths. In a number of cases, I remember the days of those deaths. But what I also know is that I have to honor those deaths by trying to live my life in a way that that those lost friends would appreciate. Remembering them, carrying them forward with me is heartening. I can't just grieve them. I have to make something of their deaths in my life, my lucky life for having survived.
So it sounds like there is some kind of interesting balance there. It's like you need to cope with it, but at the same time, if you try to push it too fast, you end up going into the column of denial of your feelings, or it's easy to slip into that. So it's like, sounds like a funny kind of balance that you have to like keep yourself from sinking into the abyss, but at the same time, acknowledge that the feelings that you have are valid.
I don't know about pushing it too fast. I think that it's human to just almost immediately repress it.
Mm.
So one of my favorite writers about the Vietnam War said, he's a journalist, by the way, in a book called Dispatches. He said, a lot of what happened got stored just behind my eyeballs. Well, that's the way it is. It's just too much, So I think it's very human to just repress it immediately and not try to come to terms with it.
I think we were more acculturated or trained to repress than we were to express in my family experience. I was not exposed to death. I was protected from bad things. And then I had a mother who was probably triply repressed because of her upbringing. And so it's something I luckily, I feel I learned about when I was in my mid-20s, and as I was exposed to that writing of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But over the years, I have watched and expected and worried about my two brothers who survive, and both were in the military, and other close people to me that I've gone through their grief as well as my own, and I realize we're not well prepared for this. And I think this conversation can be very helpful. It is being very helpful. I hope people will tune in and listen to it after the fact.
Well, that brings us to a very interesting articulation here, Betty, and that is, what can we do about it? How should we feel about it? Or what are some useful? It's not like this is the way it should be, but what are some useful ways that we can feel about grief that positions us to go forward, to acknowledge our loss, and then to go forward in that, even after losing that.
Well, this is a reiteration, I guess, of what I have said, but the best thing you can do for yourself is to do for others.
Mm,
in my view.
Mhm.
Everything that you can do for others ultimately hardens and comforts you, or at least that's been my experience.
Mm.
Live lovingly, if you want a slogan.
yeah.
Live lovingly and care about others.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
do whatever you can for whomever. Everybody's hurt. You know, I used to think that as a teacher, I have to be careful not to be judgmental of any of my students, even if they behave negatively, because they may be carrying something I have no frame of reference for. I have to keep that in mind,
Mhm.
and behave accordingly. In other words, be outside myself and thinking of them. I mean, I don't mean to start moralizing here, but it's just, you know, it's simple, but it's also true, isn't it? Is that arguable even? Of course not.
Well, I think while I will agree it's not arguable, what I have also observed is that a lot of people don't see the map to that. You know, in other words, if you're feeling that already, then maybe you can put it into practice. But a lot of times the reason we feel isolated and lonely is because we haven't had those kind of connections. You know, I remember recently talking to one of the inmates, and he was expressing how difficult it was for him, even though he understood cognitively that he should love other people and care about other people. He said, I don't know, you know, when people talk about love and stuff, I just don't know what they're talking about because I never felt that. You know, the things that they're talking about, I never felt. And the things that people are saying, well, you know, you should do this for people. Nobody did that for me. And I never really, you know, if they did love me, I never felt that they loved me. Or maybe I felt it, but I didn't know what it was. But anyway, there was like a disconnect. So it was like I was saying something in a foreign language, you know. So that may be a useful thing to try to find a pathway to um, what's the practice, you know? What is the thing that, what is the incident? What is the thing that happens that allows us to connect with others so that one, we can help them bear the burden of their grief, but also so that when people are trying to do it for us, we can accept it with grace, you know, because that sometimes we feel that because if we never given it, when somebody's trying to give it to us, it just might feel icky or phony, you know, even when we need it.
Probably most when we need it. I think, you know, what Jason brought up about communal grief,
Mm,
you know, ritual and you know, rites, whatever they are so helpful. And even and you know this, if when you go through it, particularly when you're younger, sometimes that feels, like you said, it doesn't feel like necessarily a warm, big, fuzzy hug or something, but it's still, it helps even if you have those feelings, because that's part of the communication. That's part of the fact that says, you know, other people feel this as well. We feel this with you. I mean, that's part of that community. So in a lot of ways, you know, I've always talked about that magic and loss thing. It's hard to have one without the other. And so like grief, it can be a binding agent. You don't want it to be a destructive binding agent, but it can be, in the sense that if you handle it as a community, it lightens the load and it does tie you together because everybody experiences it. Even the hardest of hard people have a sense of loss when their situation changes, when they're put in some place they're not familiar with. And I try to stick to that when I feel like I'm, you know, dealing with things on my own. And I you know, I realize, okay, there's community. So I go back to ritual sometimes. For me, that's writing like I've written with others, but it's also being in things like this, just sharing, you know, the thing that we experience together. Because death is something, and loss, all these things are things everybody experiences. But if you don't talk about it, you don't express it. You get back to what Charles is talking about, Chuck. You said, you know, it's destructive.
Mm,
It will shape you in ways you can't see.
mm,
And, you know, that's no good for anybody.
mm, mm.
We've also talked about this in other conversations, but reading substantive literature is also very comforting.
Mm.
We are not alone. Others have felt what we've felt and have found ways through their various griefs. My students used to tease me a little bit, can we read stories with happy endings? And my response is, we do, because those stories are fiction, but the suffering is real, and we learn from them, those sufferings, and we're comforted by them, and are better able to cope with what's to come. You know, we ought not to be surprised by life. If you read seriously, you're much better prepared for whatever befalls you. And you're very comforted, I think, by the feelings of others articulated so well. And what Pope said, but oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. I read poetry every day. I wouldn't let a day pass without reading good poetry, and including poems I've read many times before. They're just endlessly comforting and sustaining, I think. You know, I'm just maybe sounding like an old English prof, arguing his discipline, but I'm not. You know, I just wish people would read and read more seriously and read more continuously. It's so helpful.
I agree with you, Charles. Reading and sharing other experiences, and also writing. You mentioned writing those poems or writing things down. I know that really helped me when I lost Sam. In fact, I wrote a poem when the day that he came home from losing his leg, they amputated his leg, and I titled it "Sam, I Am," and it was kind of an homage or a tribute to him and the life that he lived as an individual, but mainly his service life, because that's how he was so connected to the world. And he did suffer from you know, from different kinds of traumas, but the trauma of him losing a leg and having to deal with that, I just felt that he was going to have a very difficult time living from then on. He lost it in February 14th, and I wrote the poem then to honor him. And actually, it got published in 2 different anthologies, and mainly because I think it hit home to this process of grieving and him losing that leg. But he died 3 months later, because I knew that running and being very physically active was always so important to him and part of his life, and losing that. But reading and trying to find things that you can connect with, I think, is really important. There was a book, it's about grieving and loss and mourning, but it's also about forgiveness and compassion. And it was written by Christy Heacock out of Rapid City. And the book is called Being Human is Hard, Choose Forgiveness. And so I think part of that is understanding, you know, who you are as a person, and seeing the way that other people have coped and other people have dealt with losses, and also dealing with forgiving others that may have harmed them or caused them to live a different life that maybe they didn't know or didn't expect. But and now I sound like I'm proselytizing, so I'm going to stop.
Well, you know, sometimes that's part of the mix, of trying to find solutions and ways to cope with these very human but very complex emotional conflicts, the inner conflicts that we have. The need uh, to sort of socialize and not quote bring other people into our grief, but at the same time the need to share that grief in order to deal with it. So, and I could go on ad nauseum about all the conflicts, that the inner conflicts that we're faced with being human. But I would be remiss if I didn't uh, search out or try to crowdsource some ways that we could help others deal with their grief. What are some ways that we can do that?
The first thing I think is to be time sensitive. We're inclined to think in terms of grief periods and limits to grief times. And of course, grief is limitless. We ought to know and respect that Jace continues to grieve Sam, and she always will. But we should be sensitive to that, rather than thinking in terms of grief periods and getting over it, which is, I think, a general reaction to grief, because grief makes people uncomfortable, so let's not acknowledge that that's still going on, you just don't outlive grief, you live with it. And so we have to be sensitive to that in others, in each other. I think that's the main thing.
Interesting. Yeah. Any other suggestions?
Just sort of putting a little addendum on what Charles just said. I've often thought of that too. There's no time frame, no limit to grieving, but people do try to obliterate a person's grief, and that's not helpful. So I tried it with my sister, particularly, who recently was widowed, to keep reassuring her that she should do things in her own time.
Yeah. Anyone else? Things that you can do?
Be a good listener.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That I've learned early on never to say, I know how you feel, because I don't know how they feel. I can kind of imagine, but everyone feels differently, and everyone has to deal with their grief and their loss in their own way, in their own time. And so I appreciate the discussion today, Lawrence. Maybe I needed this too today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. You bet. Well, I think I've often reflected on that, Jace, about how that we need a time and our own time, and that having a time from the outside just sort of doesn't feel right. But sometimes I think people say they try to handle grief like they handle when a kid gets hurt, and they'll say, well, don't cry, be a man, like be a big boy, and don't cry. And I've often wondered, well, where does that really come from? If the person's hurt, they're hurt, and saying not to cry doesn't stop the hurt. You're just saying, don't bother me with your hurt, kind of thing. I mean, that's the way it always felt to me, that, even when it was happening to other people, just say, okay, well, and like when the kid is hurt, sometimes what they just need is a hug, or someone to just sit there and just say, is there something I can do for you? I mean, of course, in the case the kid's hurt, if they're bleeding out, there's certainly something you can do, and you don't have to ask them. But in the emotional sense, you know, encouraging that person to talk about it if when they feel like it, you know, when they can find words. And I find that it's, you know, dealing with grief is is sometimes a matter of finding words to help you keep track of those emotions, you know, so that you can deal with them. And so often the things that are complex for us as humans, when we can find a word or even make up a word for those feelings, it helps us to revisit it until our the emotional part of us calms down. And I'm reminded of some work that has been done around things similar to that, where we have this body-mind connection to some traumatic event, you know, and that there could be a grievous event. But what happens often is the body stores, you know, you first get some kind of mental or emotional charge, and the body tends to absorb that charge in terms of like muscles that are tense, increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, and things like that, all those autonomic nervous system things. And so sometimes things, you get that feeling again, and your brain is trying to make sense of it, and it may not have a connection, but it'll bring back that feeling that you had of grief, because that was what it was, that was stored up in your body. And there are people who are doing interesting experiments now where they do things like introduce a beta blocker, which is something you use in heart medicine to sort of like chill everything out when, you know, when your heart is and autonomic nervous system is going off the chart. So they give you these beta blockers, and that chills you out. Well, now they're starting to deal with people who have these emotional responses all charged up. They give them the beta blockers, and they can talk about it more objectively. And over time, they disconnect that body reaction to things, and it goes away. PTSD, people are dealing with PTSD with that kind of solution now. Same with rape victims, you know. So I have a feeling that a lot of the things that we feel in grief, they get stored up in our bodies. You know, they get stored up in a certain tenseness. And once we can just come to grips with my husband, my friend, my daughter, my dog is dead now. And what we had that, you know, we had that great feeling, and we had some, I can remember that person fondly, but my body doesn't tell me that we're in crisis again. And it doesn't convince my mind that I should go into uh, you know, some kind of depression, because I've just dealt with it as it was a thing, and eventually that will happen to me too. And you know, it's just part of life, and we can let it go. But you can't do that, I think, as long as there's that emotional charge is there, and that emotional charge is real. It's just as real as the physical one. So I, I think maybe we're starting, you know, science is starting to approach ways that we can deal with it, but we're not. I don't think we're there yet. You know, I think we've reached our time. It's been a an interesting discussion. I'd like to thank all of you who did participate and bring some uh, depth to this discussion. We will see you guys again next week, and we're going to next week we're going to revisit a subject we talked about last week, and that was having meaningful conversation by popular demand. Some people called Ryan and said, "Hey, you know, we kind of like there's more stuff we should say about that, because that's very useful. I found that very useful, and there's more things we can explore. And so we said, okay, this is about what people want to talk about. And we remind you too, if there are things that you think should be a topic that you would like to discuss, please email Ryan to, you know, to put that on the agenda. He and I have meetings. So if you email him, we can talk about how we would introduce that. Can we combine it with some other ideas that we had? What do I need to do to, if I'm not familiar with that subject, what do I need to do to become familiar with it? You know, so but next week we'll pick up on that, and there's some other angles to having some meaningful conversation. So I hope you will also think about what is it that you could do to make conversations more meaningful, especially with people who are, let's say, more difficult to talk to. You know, so we'll see you same time, same station next week.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.